Rain glazed the towers of Midtown Manhattan, turning the city into a corridor of silver light and silent ambition. Inside a private conference room high above Park Avenue, Clara Holloway sat at the end of a long walnut table, the skyline stretching behind her like a witness that had seen everything. The air carried the scent of leather, ink, and generational power. Across from her, Dominic Sterling's attorney arranged papers with the calm precision of a man used to watching women fold. Clara did not fold. She wore a simple black coat, her dark hair pulled back, her face bare of diamonds or apology. To the press, she had been the quiet wife, librarian turned lucky bride, lifted from obscurity by a tech titan. What they never printed were the nights she spent writing the architecture of the algorithm that made Dominic untouchable, or the way credit slipped from her hands and into his speeches. "You understand," the attorney said smoothly, sliding the settlement forward, "that you leave with nothing." Clara lifted the pen, her pulse steady. "No," she replied, signing her name with deliberate grace. "He does." Far below, a ballroom shimmered with champagne and arrogance as Dominic prepared to toast a future built on borrowed brilliance. He believed the empire was secure. He had no idea it was about to answer to its true creator. If stories of quiet power and reckoning speak to you, like this video and subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales. The applause hadn't even finished echoing when the glass began to hum. It started as a vibration beneath polished shoes. Subtle, almost elegant, the kind of tremor that makes people glance around but not yet panic. Dominic Sterling stood beneath a canopy of crystal light, smiling into a sea of raised phones, the kind of curated grin that had sold investors on a future he claimed to see before anyone else. His tuxedo was immaculate. His confidence was rehearsed. His name floated across the LED wall behind him in 10-foot letters. Then the hum deepened. A low metallic roar rolled across the skyline, growing louder, closer, until the ballroom windows trembled in their steel frames. Champagne rippled inside flutes. A violinist missed a note. Conversations broke mid-sentence. Dominic's smile tightened. "What is that?" someone whispered near the stage. The answer came in a shadow. A matte black jet tore past the windows, so low the chandeliers swayed violently overhead. The engine's scream cut through the ballroom like a blade. Women grabbed at their earrings. A senator ducked instinctively. Glass vibrated hard enough to rattle teeth. The aircraft didn't just pass. Circled. Low. Deliberate. The LED wall flickered once. The Sterling Dynamics logo fractured into static. Dominic turned sharply toward the tech booth. "Fix it. Now." His voice carried authority, but something underneath it had cracked. The technicians were already pale, fingers flying across keyboards. "We don't have control," one of them muttered. "It's external." The music died. The static cleared. A legal document appeared in stark white against black. Patent registration, Aegis Predictive Core Inventor. Clara Holloway. A wave moved through the ballroom, not loud, not yet, but heavy. Shifted. Heads tilted. Phones lifted. Dominic exhaled a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a stunt." The document scrolled. Timestamps from 8 years ago. Encrypted authorship logs. Biometric confirmations tied to Clara's credentials. Sebastian stepped closer to the screen, color draining from his face. "Dom," he said quietly, "those are original server signatures." Dominic didn't answer. The screen split in half. On one side, the patent evidence. On the other, a live video feed from inside the jet. Clara sat in a cream leather seat, city lights gliding beneath the aircraft. Her posture was still, her expression steady. No anger, no tremor, just certainty. "Good evening, Dominic." Her voice filled the ballroom, clear, unshaken. The jet roared again outside, as if punctuating her entrance. Dominic grabbed a microphone. "This is illegal. Shut it down." The microphone cut dead in his hand. A ripple of uneasy laughter died instantly. Clara didn't blink. "You told them you built the future," she said calmly. Let's correct that. Dominic's jaw flexed. I architected Aegis, she continued. Every predictive layer. Every adaptive model. You didn't invent it. You marketed it. A murmur swelled across the room. That's a lie. Dominic snapped toward the silent mic, forgetting it was useless. He looked up at the cameras instead. She had no role in core development. Patent scroll paused. Highlighted sections magnified. Clara Holloway, primary author ghostwriter 177, verified internal handle. Sebastian's phone buzzed. He stared at it. His breathing changed. Dominic, he whispered. What? The offshore reserves are moving. Dominic turned slowly. What do you mean moving? They're draining. Several investors checked their phones simultaneously. The glow from their screens reflected shock across their faces. Numbers were falling in real time. Massive transfers. Automated, relentless. Redirected to an entity labeled the Obsidian Trust. Dominic's pulse pounded visibly in his temple. Clara leaned slightly forward on the screen. You erased my name from the patent filings, she said. You erased my access. You erased my credit. What you forgot was that I wrote the failsafe. The ballroom felt smaller now. I embedded a royalty recovery protocol. Unauthorized executive claims trigger compensation extraction. The jet engines thundered once more, glass shaking violently. Trading halted, SDR pending federal review. The words appeared across the screen in bold red. An audible gasp tore through the ballroom. Dominic stood frozen beneath the collapse of his own illusion. The room that once leaned toward him now leaned away. You think this makes you powerful? He shouted toward the screen, voice raw, unfiltered. Clara's eyes held his. No, she replied evenly. It makes me visible. The feed cut. Silence didn't just fall. It settled. Phones buzzed in unison. Investors stepped back. Sebastian swallowed hard. The board is calling an emergency session. Arthur Pendleton pushed through the crowd, face ashen. The SEC just froze corporate liquidity. Dominic looked around at the faces that once admired him. No one stepped closer. The jet climbed into the clouds and disappeared. And Dominic Sterling, who had built his empire on applause, stood alone beneath a room full of witnesses who had just watched it burn. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Not yet for him, but coming. The ballroom emptied in fragments. Not all at once. Not dramatically. People left the way investors always leave. Quietly, efficiently, protecting their own positions before anyone else's. Conversations dropped to whispers. Heels clicked toward exits. A senator avoided eye contact. A venture capitalist who once bragged about backing Dominic slipped his phone into his pocket as if proximity itself had become dangerous. Dominic remained near the stage, staring at the blank LED wall that only minutes ago had projected his name in towering light. Sebastian approached slowly, as though Dominic might detonate. We need to control the narrative, Sebastian said under his breath. Call the press. Say it's corporate sabotage. Say she hacked internal systems. Dominic didn't blink. She couldn't have, he muttered. She doesn't have access. Sebastian's silence said more than agreement ever could. Arthur Pendleton stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost human. Dominic, those biometric signatures are hers. If federal investigators validate them, this isn't just civil. Dominic turned sharply. Don't you dare panic. Arthur's jaw tightened. I'm not panicking. I'm calculating. Dominic looked around the thinning room. The crystal, the abandoned champagne glasses, the orchestra packing instruments into velvet cases. The celebration had dissolved into evacuation. The applause he once commanded had evaporated. For the first time that night, Dominic felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear. Exposure. Hours later, the penthouse overlooked a city that no longer looked like an audience. It looked like distance. Dominic tore off his tuxedo jacket and threw it across the marble floor. A crystal decanter shattered against the fireplace. His reflection fractured in the broken glass. He grabbed his phone. Voicemails stacked endlessly. CC Compliance Officer. Board Chairman. 2 major institutional investors demanding explanations. He deleted them all. Instead, he opened a concealed compartment in the wall and retrieved a burner phone. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he dialed. The line connected without greeting. "I need a resolution," Dominic said flatly. Specify. Clara Holloway. The voice on the other end remained neutral. "That name is trending globally. I don't care. High visibility subjects increase risk. I don't care." Another pause. "Transfer terms. Immediate." The call ended. Dominic stood motionless in the quiet. He walked to the window and looked down at the city grid below. Traffic lights blinking red and green, unaware of the storm unfolding above them. "You thought you could humiliate me," he murmured toward the glass. "You forgot who I am." But even as he said it, the words lacked weight. Because somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the arrogance, something had shifted. He had not seen this coming. And that terrified him more than losing money. In Zurich, dawn brushed pale gold across the river. Clara stood alone on a balcony overlooking water that moved without urgency. Snow lingered on rooftops. The world felt quiet in a way Manhattan never allowed. Victor approached without sound. "He's spiraling," Victor said. "Crypto transfers are moving through secondary channels." Clara nodded once. "He won't absorb this quietly. You think he'll escalate?" "I know he will." Victor studied her profile. "You could vanish. Change countries. New identity." She shook her head gently. "If I disappear, he rebuilds sympathy. He paints himself as betrayed. He rewrites the story." Her eyes reflected the river below. "This ends clean." Victor hesitated. "He's dangerous when cornered." Clara allowed herself a small breath. "I lived beside him for 7 years," she said softly. "I know exactly how he behaves when he loses." There was no bitterness in her voice, only precision. Back in Chicago, the emergency board meeting felt less like strategy and more like survival. Faces that once praised Dominic now avoided him. One director leaned forward. "We need a public statement acknowledging co-development." "That would be admitting liability," Dominic snapped. "It would be limiting prison time," the director shot back. The word hung in the air. Prison. Dominic's chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor as he stood. "You are all overreacting. Trading is halted," another board member said. "Federal auditors are requesting internal archives. Our institutional partners are liquidating." Dominic felt something hot rise in his throat. "They're panicking because they don't understand scale." The chairman leaned forward slowly. "No, Dominic. They're panicking because they just watched you get exposed." The room went silent. Dominic stared at him. "You think she wins?" Dominic asked, voice low. The chairman didn't flinch. "I think the market already decided." Later that night, Dominic paced the penthouse again, restless. He checked encrypted messages. Confirmation. The asset was en route. 8 hours until contact. Dominic exhaled slowly. "If I can't restore the narrative," he muttered, "I eliminate the threat." His reflection in the dark window no longer looked triumphant. It looked hunted. Zurich Cathedral doors opened quietly. Clara sat alone, hands resting gently in her lap. The silence inside the stone walls felt older than ambition. Footsteps echoed behind her. Measured. A man in a gray coat paused near a statue, then shifted toward her pew. "You're predictable," he murmured. "Am I?" Clara replied without turning. "You stayed visible. I never left." A suppressed barrel brushed lightly against the back of her coat. "Where is the physical key?" "Gone." He leaned closer. "Wrong answer." Clara's breathing stayed even. "You're too late." For a split second, something flickered in the assassin's eyes. Calculation. Then chaos erupted. Glass exploded above them. Victor moved from the altar. Gunfire ricocheted against stone. The assassin dove rolled, disappeared through side doors. Side tires screeched. Clara stumbled into the waiting vehicle, heart steady despite the noise. Victor shut the door hard. "You're bleeding," he said. "Superficial," she replied calmly. As they accelerated into narrow streets, Victor lifted a small transmitter. "He's tagged." Clara nodded. "Good." Her voice carried no triumph, only continuation. Hours later, inside a secure Alpine residence, Clara listened to the recorded transmission. Kalen's voice came through clearly. "She baited you," he told Dominic over encrypted line. "You underestimated her." Dominic's response crackled with fury. "Bring her to me. I want it finished." Clara closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Intent. Recorded. Verifiable. Victor met her gaze. "That's enough." Clara opened her eyes. "Not yet." He stood. "Now he comes himself." High above the Alps, wind pressed hard against reinforced glass. SUV engines echoed along the winding road. Dominic stepped out before the vehicle fully stopped. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open. "Where is it?" he demanded. Clara stood near the fireplace, calm. "You look exhausted." He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her arm. "You destroyed everything. I exposed it." His grip tightened. "You think this makes you righteous? I think it makes you accountable." Kalen scanned the space. "Secure the drive," he muttered. Clara pointed to the laptop. "It's there." Dominic flipped it open. The screen lit instantly. A live broadcast. Thousands of viewers. Federal agencies logged in. Dominic froze. Red indicator lights blinked discreetly from hidden corners. "You're streaming this," he whispered. "Transparency," Clara replied. Kalen checked his phone. His expression changed. "Contract void." Dominic turned sharply. "You can't walk." Kalen holstered his weapon. "I don't work for clients under federal indictment." He left. Sirens wailed faintly below the mountain road. Dominic's shoulders sagged. For the first time, the anger drained from his face. "What did you want?" he asked hoarsely. "My name," Clara said. Police breached the entrance moments later. Dominic was restrained swiftly, efficiently. No dramatic resistance. No cinematic final speech. Just handcuffs closing around wrists that once signed billion-dollar deals. As he was escorted outside, flashing blue lights reflected across the snow. Cameras from news drones hovered above, broadcasting globally. Clara watched from inside the doorway. Her expression held no celebration, only release. And somewhere in that silence, the power dynamic that had defined 7 years quietly reversed, not through revenge, but through truth made impossible to ignore. The first night in federal custody was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no final monologues, just fluorescent lighting that hummed without sympathy. Dominic sat alone on a steel bench, hands folded in front of him, the echo of the handcuffs still lingering in his wrists. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something older, consequence. Across the country, financial networks replayed footage of his arrest in slow motion. Analysts dissected every frame. Commentators debated whether his downfall had been arrogance or inevitability. But inside that holding room, the noise of the world felt distant. Dominic lifted his head when the door opened. Arthur Pendleton stepped in, no longer wearing the controlled confidence of a fixer. His tie was loosened, his voice careful. "They're charging you with fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy," Arthur said quietly. Dominic didn't respond. Arthur continued. "The audio recording is admissible. The assassination order. The asset transfer trail. It's airtight." Dominic finally spoke. "She orchestrated this." Arthur's expression flickered. Not disagreement, not agreement. something closer to realism. She prepared for this, Arthur corrected. Dominic leaned back against the wall, eyes fixed forward. She always thought she was smarter. Arthur hesitated. She was. The words landed with more force than any accusation. In Zurich, Clara sat at a long wooden table, sunlight filtering softly through tall windows. The air carried the scent of fresh coffee and snow melting outside. Tobias projected global headlines across a monitor. Markets are stabilizing, he said. But sterling dynamics is in freefall. Clara watched silently. Victor stood near the window. He'll try to negotiate, Victor said. Plea for reduced sentencing. Claim diminished responsibility. Clara's gaze didn't move from the screen. He'll blame me. Tobias exhaled. You could destroy him further. You still have unreleased files. Clara folded her hands slowly. I don't need to destroy him. Victor turned toward her. You don't. She shook her head. The truth is enough. There was no vengeance in her tone, just finality. Days later, the courtroom felt colder than the mountains. Dominic entered wearing a standard-issue suit, stripped of custom tailoring and press-ready polish. Flashbulbs exploded outside the courthouse steps, but inside, the lighting was clinical and unforgiving. The judge reviewed evidence with measured composure. Audio played across the courtroom speakers. Dominic's voice ordering a hit. Clear. Undeniable. The gallery murmured. Dominic's jaw tightened, but he didn't look toward Clara. He couldn't. She sat several rows back, composed, neither smiling nor flinching. The prosecutor spoke steadily. This is not merely a corporate dispute. This is systemic deception coupled with violent intent. Arthur leaned toward Dominic and whispered something urgent. Dominic nodded once, stiffly. When the judge denied bail, the sound of the gavel felt heavier than the jet engines that had shaken Manhattan days before. Dominic's shoulders sagged, not dramatically, but enough to signal something irreversible. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged. Microphones stretched forward. Ms. Holloway, do you feel vindicated? Was this revenge? Clara paused before answering. It was accountability, she said simply. No grandstanding. No theatrics. Just clarity. Meanwhile, the corporate structure of Sterling Dynamics collapsed under scrutiny. Internal emails surfaced revealing years of credit manipulation. Engineers testified that Clara's authorship had been quietly erased from documentation. One former developer told investigators, "We knew who wrote the backbone. We just weren't allowed to say it." Class action lawsuits multiplied. Investors who once praised Dominic now demanded restitution. The empire didn't explode. It imploded. Slowly. Publicly. Weeks passed. In a private meeting room overlooking Lake Geneva, Harrison Blackwood studied Clara with a mix of admiration and disbelief. You could reclaim everything, he said. Rebrand. Relaunch. Own the market. Clara sipped her tea thoughtfully. I don't want the market. Harrison frowned slightly. You're walking away from billions. She met his gaze evenly. I'm walking toward integrity. He shook his head with a faint smile. You're an unusual kind of powerful. Power without ethics isn't power, she replied quietly. It's leverage. Late one evening, Clara opened her laptop and accessed the full Aegis repository. The code scrolled down the screen. Years of precision, sleepless nights, brilliance built quietly while someone else collected applause. Tobias leaned over her shoulder. You're really doing it, he asked. She nodded. Upload it. Open source. Completely. Tobias hesitated. This changes everything. That's the point. He pressed enter. Within minutes, the architecture propagated across global servers. Universities began downloading it. Medical researchers integrated predictive diagnostics. Renewable energy networks optimized their load balancing. The algorithm once weaponized for financial dominance now began solving real problems. Clara closed her laptop gently. Victor watched her carefully. No regrets, he asked. She looked out at the water beyond the window. None. In a federal detention facility, Dominic watched coverage of the open-source release on a mounted television. The anchor spoke with admiration. The Holloway core is being hailed as a breakthrough for global infrastructure. Dominic's expression hardened. She's giving it away, he muttered. A guard glanced at him briefly, uninterested. For the first time, Dominic understood something that had always eluded him. Control had never been ownership. And ownership had never been respect. He had mistaken applause for legacy. Months later, the trial concluded. The prosecution laid out years of financial manipulation, recorded conversations, transaction histories. When Dominic took the stand, he attempted composure. She was unstable, he said. Emotionally volatile. The prosecutor didn't raise her voice. Is that why you ordered her eliminated? The courtroom fell silent. Dominic faltered. For a man who once commanded conference rooms effortlessly, words now felt heavy and uncertain. The jury deliberated less than 2 days. Guilty on all major counts. When the sentence was read, decades in federal prison, Dominic closed his eyes briefly. No outburst, no denial. Just the slow collapse of a persona he had curated for years. Clara did not attend sentencing. She didn't need to. The verdict spoke for itself. That evening, in a small bookstore along the Amalfi Coast, warm light spilled across wooden shelves. Clara stacked copies of Dante's Inferno while a radio in the corner reported the sentencing. Dominic Sterling will serve 28 years. She didn't look up. Victor entered quietly. It's done, he said. Clara placed the final book neatly in its row. Yes, she replied softly. Outside, the Mediterranean shimmered under fading sunlight. Inside, the air felt steady. No urgency, no ambition, just space. Victor studied her for a long moment. You changed the system. She shook her head gently. I corrected it. He nodded. Silence lingered comfortably between them. Far away, a prison door closed with a metallic echo that would define Dominic's remaining years. But in this quiet corner of the world, Clara inhaled deeply. Not in triumph, not in revenge, but in peace earned honestly. And as the evening settled over the coastline, the story that had begun with arrogance and erasure now stood as something far more enduring. A reminder that truth, once exposed, does not need to shout to win. The headlines faded faster than anyone expected. At first, every network carried Dominic's sentencing in rotation. Panels debated ethics in tech. Editorials dissected corporate culture. His face appeared beside words like disgrace, deception, collapse. Then the cycle moved on. Scandals always do. What didn't move on was the impact. Across rural clinics in Kenya, physicians began using the Holloway core to predict complications before they became fatal. In northern India, grid operators balanced energy loads with new precision. Independent researchers in Sao Paulo adapted the algorithm to anticipate flooding in coastal neighborhoods long ignored by infrastructure planners. Clara never gave interviews about it. She didn't host conferences. She didn't brand it. She let the work speak in quiet places where headlines never reached. In Positano, mornings unfolded slowly. The bookstore opened to the scent of sea air and espresso drifting from the cafe next door. Clara stacked paperbacks, recommended novels to tourists, and learned the names of elderly regulars who came in more for conversation than literature. She was known simply as Kiara. No one there connected her to financial collapse or courtroom verdicts. And that anonymity felt like oxygen. Victor visited often, though never on a schedule. He'd stand near the doorway for a moment before stepping fully inside, as if giving her space to remain whatever she chose to be. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered in through the front windows, he leaned against a shelf and studied her carefully. You ever miss it? He asked. Miss what? The scale. The influence. Clara smiled faintly without looking up from the book in her hands. Influence isn't measured in headlines, she said. Victor didn't argue, because he had seen what unchecked influence looked like. And he had seen what it cost. In federal prison, Dominic adjusted slowly to routine. The first weeks were marked by disbelief. Appeals drafted, attorneys consulted, strategies whispered across monitored phone lines. He still spoke as though he were orchestrating a comeback. But as months passed and appeals stalled, the language changed. Conversations shortened. Phone privileges became quieter. In the common room, an old television mounted high in the corner occasionally aired segments about open-source breakthroughs powered by the Holloway core. One afternoon, Dominic looked up just as the anchor said her name. Clara Holloway. Not as his former wife. Not as a disgruntled partner. As the architect. The camera cut to a university lab where young engineers spoke with admiration about transparency and integrity. Dominic stared for a long time after the segment ended. No applause. No stock tickers. No applause to command. Just the hum of fluorescent lights and the scrape of chairs on linoleum. For the first time, he understood that power borrowed without credit had always been fragile. And fragility, once exposed, does not recover. Back in Italy, Clara stood on the balcony behind the bookstore, the Mediterranean stretching endlessly below. She held a letter in her hand. Handwritten. No return address. Victor stepped outside quietly. "You're sure you want to read that?" he asked. She unfolded it carefully. Dominic's handwriting was unmistakable. The letter wasn't an apology. It wasn't rage. It was something quieter. "I built a narrative," he had written. "I thought success justified the edits." Clara read the line twice. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel triumph. She felt distance. Victor waited. She folded the letter once more. "What will you do with it?" he asked. She walked to the edge of the balcony. Below, waves moved against stone. She let the paper go. It drifted briefly before disappearing into water. "No reply," she said softly. "Some stories don't need continuation." Months later, an invitation arrived from an international ethics forum requesting Clara to speak. Victor raised an eyebrow when she showed him. "You could inspire thousands," he said. Clara looked at the letter thoughtfully. "Inspiration shouldn't require a stage," she replied. But she went anyway. The auditorium wasn't glamorous. Students filled the seats. Researchers, educators, activists. No venture capitalists. No political donors. She stood behind a simple podium. "I'm not here to talk about revenge," she began. The room quieted. "I'm here to talk about ownership. Not of profit. Of contribution." She spoke about invisible labor. About how brilliance often hides behind louder personalities. About systems that reward presentation over creation. She didn't mention Dominic by name. She didn't need to. The lesson was clear without accusation. Afterward, a young woman approached her. "I've been working on a climate modeling project," she said nervously. "But my supervisor takes credit." Clara held her gaze. "Document everything," she advised gently. "And never let silence become agreement." The student nodded, eyes bright. Moments like that mattered more than market caps ever had. In Chicago, a former Sterling Dynamics engineer testified in a congressional hearing about intellectual transparency. "Corporate culture enables erasure," he said under oath. "But erasure only works when the erased accept it." The camera cut briefly to archival footage of Clara's exposure broadcast. The narrative had shifted permanently. Not toward scandal. Toward reform. One evening in Positano, as the bookstore closed and golden light softened the cliffs, Victor placed a small wooden box on the counter. Clara glanced at it curiously. "What's that?" "Insurance," he replied. She opened it. Inside was a flash drive. "The last encrypted fragment," he explained. "Recovered from a forgotten archive. Weaponized applications. Military grade." Clara stared at it. "It survived." "Barely." He watched her carefully. "It could restore leverage," he added quietly. Clara held the drive in her palm. It felt heavier than its size suggested. For a moment, silence lingered. The temptation wasn't financial. It was control. The ability to shape outcomes again. To hold power in reserve. She walked slowly toward the balcony. Victor followed but didn't interfere. The sea below moved rhythmically, indifferent to human ambition. She turned the drive between her fingers once, then twice. "Are you sure?" Victor asked gently. Clara didn't hesitate. "I didn't fight to become what he was." She opened her hand. The drive fell. It caught a flash of sunlight before vanishing into deep blue. Victor exhaled softly. "You could have owned governments," he said. Clara leaned on the railing, wind lifting her hair slightly. "I already own something better." "What's that?" "My name." Inside the bookstore, the bell chimed as a late customer entered. Clara stepped back inside, the sea behind her undisturbed. Far away, in a federal facility, Dominic folded laundry in silence while another inmate flipped channels past a news segment praising ethical transparency reforms in tech leadership. He didn't look up this time, because there was nothing left to contest. And in that quiet acceptance, uncelebrated, untelevised, the final shift had already occurred. The empire had not only fallen, it had been replaced by something steadier. And Clara Holloway, once erased from her own creation, now moved through the world unburdened, proof that integrity once reclaimed cannot be taken again. The first anniversary of Sterling Dynamics' collapse arrived without ceremony. No commemorative headlines. No dramatic retrospectives. Just a quiet shift in how the world spoke about innovation. In a packed federal courtroom in Chicago, Dominic Sterling stood one final time before the judge for a post-sentencing review hearing. The orange of his uniform dulled the sharp angles that once graced magazine covers. His hair had thinned. His posture no longer commanded space. It occupied it carefully. Reporters filled the back rows, not because they expected surprise, but because people always come to witness the closing of a chapter. The judge reviewed compliance reports, restitution updates, cooperation details. Dominic's legal team had attempted appeals, procedural arguments, technicalities. Each one dismantled methodically. Then the prosecutor stood. "We would like to enter into record the final audit findings," she said calmly. "All concealed accounts tied to Mr. Sterling have now been recovered and redistributed to affected investors and employees." A ripple moved through the room. Dominic's jaw tightened. The prosecutor continued. "Additionally, internal communications confirm long-term credit suppression of Ms. Holloway's authorship. Civil restitution agreements have been finalized. Mr. Sterling's remaining assets are forfeited." For a man who once believed ownership meant permanence, the word sounded almost unreal. Forfeited. Permanent revocation of executive privileges. 28 years without parole eligibility. The judge's voice remained measured. "Mr. Sterling, the court finds no grounds for modification. Your sentence stands." The gavel struck. This time there were no cameras zooming in on shock. No gasp from an audience. Just the finality of sound against wood. Dominic looked briefly toward the gallery, as if expecting someone to meet his eyes. No one did. He was escorted out without resistance. Not defeated dramatically. Diminished quietly. And sometimes, quiet is the harsher punishment. In Positano, Clara closed the bookstore early that afternoon. The air carried a warm breeze from the sea. The cliffs glowed gold under the lowering sun. Victor waited outside, leaning against the stone wall. "It's official," he said simply. She nodded once. She had read the court update hours earlier but hadn't reacted outwardly. "How do you feel?" he asked. Clara considered the question honestly. "Relieved," she answered. Not victorious. Not triumphant. Relieved. They walked along the narrow cobblestone path overlooking the Mediterranean. Tourists laughed in the distance. Music drifted faintly from a nearby cafe. Victor glanced at her. "You changed more than a courtroom outcome." Clara's gaze stayed forward. "I changed what was allowed." There was a difference. Power structures rarely collapse from emotion. They collapse from exposure. Weeks later, Clara received an invitation from a global technology consortium, not asking her to speak about scandal, but asking her to lead a new initiative focused on ethical authorship protections in AI development. This time she didn't hesitate. The conference hall was filled with engineers, policymakers, and young developers from every continent. The energy felt different from the galas she once attended beside Dominic. Less ego, more curiosity. When Clara stepped onto the stage, the applause was steady but not theatrical. She didn't stand behind a massive LED wall. There were no oversized projections of her name. Just a microphone and a room of attentive faces. For years, she began evenly, innovation has been measured by visibility. But creation often happens in quiet rooms. The audience listened closely. We cannot build the future on erased contributions, she continued. We cannot allow narrative to outrank truth. She didn't speak about revenge. She didn't speak about Dominic. She spoke about transparency frameworks, authorship verification systems, digital signature protections embedded into code repositories, concrete solutions, practical reform. By the end of the session, several major institutions publicly committed to adopting new authorship validation protocols. Not because of scandal, because of structure. And that was the deeper victory. Back in the United States, Dominic adjusted to a routine that no longer included negotiation or influence. Inmates rotated through assigned duties. Days blurred. One evening, the television in the common area aired coverage of the global AI consortium. Clara appeared briefly on screen. Calm, articulate, unguarded. The segment focused on reform, not downfall. An inmate glanced at Dominic. Wasn't she your? Dominic stood before the sentence finished and walked away. There was no anger left to express. Only the echo of a choice made years ago, when he believed credit could be reassigned without consequence. For the first time he understood something simple. Legacy is not what you announce. It's what remains when you are removed. One final letter arrived in Positano. Official seal. Federal Bureau of Prisons. Clara opened it slowly. Inside was a formal request. Dominic wished to transfer certain intellectual notes to her, unfinished ideas scribbled during incarceration. He had listed her as the only intended recipient. Victor watched her read. "What will you do?" he asked quietly. Clara folded the letter carefully. She didn't tear it. She didn't burn it. She placed it inside a drawer behind the bookstore counter. "I won't carry what's not mine anymore," she said softly. Some endings don't require confrontation. They require release. As summer turned to autumn, the bookstore thrived modestly. Locals stopped in daily. Tourists lingered longer than planned. The Holloway core continued to expand globally, no longer owned, no longer controlled, but shared. Researchers cited her openly. Students referenced her case study in ethics seminars. Her name no longer appeared next to scandal. It appeared next to principle. One evening, as the sun dipped into the Mediterranean and painted the horizon in streaks of amber, Victor joined her on the balcony once more. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd taken the money?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "I'd still be proving something," she replied. "And now? I don't need to." Below them, waves moved rhythmically against stone, steady, indifferent to ambition. Victor studied her for a moment. "You know," he said, "a lot of people think you brought down an empire." Clara leaned against the railing. "No," she said gently. "He did." The difference mattered. Because she hadn't destroyed him. She had simply refused to remain invisible. Far away, steel doors locked for the night in a federal facility where Dominic Sterling lay awake, staring at a ceiling that did not echo his name. And here, on a quiet coastline under an open sky, Clara Holloway breathed in air that belonged to no one else. The applause that once crowned him had faded. The credit that once erased her had been restored. The system had been forced to correct itself. And in the end, the most satisfying truth wasn't that the empire collapsed. It was that the name he tried to remove now stood stronger than the company he tried to protect. Not whispered. Not hidden. Unshakably hers. The last court document was signed on a quiet Tuesday. There were no cameras waiting this time, no breaking news banners, no analysts debating impact. Just a final confirmation that the appeals were exhausted and the sentence would stand. The chapter that began with applause and arrogance had closed with paperwork and steel doors. Clara didn't celebrate. She stood behind the counter of the bookstore as afternoon light spilled across worn wooden floors. A young girl approached the register holding a second-hand copy of a programming manual, its spine creased, its pages marked with someone else's notes. "Do you think I could really build something big one day?" the girl asked, almost apologetically. Clara looked at her not as a headline, not as a symbol, just as someone at the beginning. "You don't have to build something big," she said gently. "Build something true. The rest follows." The girl nodded, clutching the book like it mattered. After she left, Clara stepped outside. The sea stretched endless and steady, indifferent to empires and courtrooms alike. She understood now that strength wasn't proven by how loudly you win, but by how quietly you refuse to disappear. She didn't take back the throne. She didn't seek another stage. She reclaimed her name, and that was enough. Far away, a man who once believed he owned the narrative stared at walls that no longer echoed his voice. And here, under open sky, Clara inhaled freedom that required no permission. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that truth has weight, and it always settles where it belongs. Like this video, and subscribe to Canada's Heartfelt Tales so you never miss the next story of courage, consequence, and quiet power.